in his
Charles
pocket.
Branham had enclosed
There were other
enough
chores
money
to do
with
on
his letter
Monday,
so that Ella could
but as
hire
long
a
as
wagon
his
for the
candy
move.
held out,
She had
Billy
few
was a young
possessions
man
to
of
load,
leisure.
other than her 3
On
squirming
wash day,
boys.
Ella used a long, flat hickory stick to stir clothes in the boiler.
New Albany lay over 100 miles north of Burkesville, and being almost due to deliver, Ella dreaded the journey. But to 3-year-old Billy, who had never seen beyond his mountain cabin, the trip seemed like an exciting adventure. He was especially impressed by the narrow, flat wooden bridge that crossed the Ohio River between Louisville, Kentucky, and New Albany, Indiana. Another 10 miles north brought them to their new home, the small town of Utica, Indiana. On May 27, 1912, Ella bore her 4th son, naming him Melvin. That summer Charles worked for a local farmer. It was man-killing labor. Sometimes he had to trudge behind a horse and plow for 12 hours a day, sweating under the scorching sun. More than once he came home with his shirt sunburned into his back, and Ella had to cut the shirt off with scissors. When the corn came up, Charles spent his days with a goosenecked hoe, chopping creepers from between the rows. At first his hands blistered and bled. Later they formed calluses as hard as leather. He suffered all this for a mere 75 cents a day. That fall Charles went back to logging. It came to him more naturally than farming. He had grown up in the woods and had started logging at an early age. Although he weighed only 150 pounds, Charles bulged with muscles and was so skillful a logger that he could load a 900-pound log on a wagon all by himself. But as winter drew near, Charles grew uneasy. The 6 of them were living in a one-room shack, no bigger and not as well built as the log cabin they left behind in Kentucky. Logging would force him to be away from his family for weeks at a time. Not wanting his wife to suffer like she had the last winter, Charles started looking for a better situation. Spring came in 1913 before Charles found something permanent. He got a job in Jeffersonville, Indiana, working for Mr. Wathan, a multimillionaire who owned the Wathan distilleries and was part owner of a professional baseball team, the Louisville Colonels. Charles was hired as a private chauffeur because he was so good at handling horses. The job didn't pay much in cash, but it offered substantial side benefits, namely a place to live rent-free on Mr. Wathan's land. The site included a 2-room log cabin, an old barn, a large garden spot, and a small field Charles could plant for his own profit. Also, Mr. Wathan had a dairy nearby, and Charles could take home a bucket of milk every night, no small benefit for a father with 4 growing boys. Jeffersonville was a town 4 miles northeast of New Albany, on the river road locally called the Utica Pike. Mr. Wathan lived 7 miles out of town on a large estate. The cabin Charles moved into sat on a hillside overlooking the Ohio River. Weathered boards covered the structure's outside walls, and inside mud filled the chinks between the logs. The cabin had a dirt floor, 2 rooms, and a sleeping loft in the rafters above one of the rooms. The ladder to the loft was made from 2 saplings. In the middle of the floor of one room, a sawed-off stump had been rolled and flat rocks placed on top of the stump. Above this sat a wood stove made from an empty oil drum. For cooking, Ella used a little monkey stove. They even had a coal oil lamp for light. All things considered, it was a big improvement over the one-room shanty that had sheltered them in Utica. On the hillside in front of the cabin, an apple tree spread its branches over a small spring. The cool spring water served as a refrigerator through much of the summer, keeping metal cans of milk, buttermilk, and butter from spoiling too soon. Charles couldn't keep cream there. He had too many little Branhams greedy to snitch. The spring supplied the house with water until mid-August, when it would finally grow dry. Then they would have to pump their water from the well located down by the barn and carry it up the hill to the house. Billy loved the bubbling spring. A gourd dipper hung on a nail pounded into the trunk of the apple tree, but Billy seldom used it. He liked to lie on his belly in the warm grass, put his lips to the water, and suck his stomach full. Then he would fill a jug and take it to his father in the field. Charles always came home from the field famished for supper. Because he didn't have indoor plumbing, he would wash himself behind the cabin, where a bench was built against an apple tree. The bench was just a barn board tacked to the trunk, with a board at the other side for a leg and a slanting board underneath to keep the bench sturdy. All 4 boys would stand in line behind Papa to wash. When Charles rolled up the sleeves of his homemade shirt to lather up, his arm muscles would swell and ripple. Billy watched with pride, thinking, "That's my Papa. He's strong. He'll live 100 years. When I'm an old man, I'll still be watching my Papa with big muscles." Charles was only 5 feet 7 inches tall. Billy had inherited his father's dark, wavy hair and Irish good looks, but not his powerful build. Instead, Billy was lean and wiry like his mother. Billy's turn to wash came next. He took great care to keep the homemade lye soap out of his eyes. Once had been less than enough. He dried with a towel his mother had made from an empty sack of cornmeal. The towel was coarse and uncomfortable, so Billy dabbed lightly. Above the wash bench, a piece from a broken mirror was held to the tree by 5 bent nails. Billy shinnied up on the bench to see himself so that he could use the tin comb to smooth his unruly locks. Charles had built their dinner table and benches from old barn boards. The benches looked like church pews. Billy always sat next to his father at supper. Bean soup was standard fare, along with cornbread, boiled onions, and buttermilk. Ella would bake the cornbread in a pan, then put it on a plate and send the plate around the table so that everyone could break off a piece as it passed. Billy always took a corner because it had lots of crust, and he liked dipping crusty cornbread in his soup. On May 14, 1914, Billy got another brother, Edgar Lee Branham. Over the next few years, Billy's life fell into a comfortable pattern. Every Saturday afternoon, his father borrowed a mule and a covered wagon from Mr. Wathan, loaded up the family, and traveled 7 miles into town to buy groceries. The 4 youngest Branhams bounced along and back in a pile of straw, but Billy got to ride up front on the buckboard with his father and mother. Billy was always excited about going to the store because he knew exactly what would happen. Charles, who earned $3.50 a week, often spent $3 of this at the grocery store. Occasionally he splurged on a sack of brown sugar or salted barrel crackers, but mostly he bought staples like beans, potatoes, and cornmeal, the kind of food that stretched a long way. After Charles paid his bill, Mr. Grover, the grocer, would give him a sack of peppermint stick candy for his youngsters. Back in the wagon, 5 pairs of eyes watched anxiously as Papa divided 4 sticks of candy equally between his 5 boys. Right away, the 4 youngest Branhams sucked their peppermint sticks to a sliver, but Billy was shrewd. He sucked on his for a while, then rolled his candy up in a piece of brown paper torn from a grocery bag and tucked it in his pocket. He had use for it later. Saturday night, they filled the large cedar washtub with hot water and took their weekly baths, one after another, without changing the water. Ella scrubbed Billy hard with lye soap, saying, "I want to see you get as clean as a peeled onion." Then she rubbed him dry with a mealcloth towel until it felt like his hide was gone. She knew Billy was not eating a balanced diet, so every week after his bath she made him swallow a spoonful of castor oil, which she believed would help prevent colds. Billy looked at that big spoon filled with the greasy castor oil and begged, "Oh, Mama, please don't make me take it. It makes me so sick. I can't stand it." She answered, "If it don't make you sick, it won't do you any good." Billy held his nose, took the spoonful in his mouth, tried to swallow, gagged, shook all over, and finally managed to get it down. On Sunday, Ella cooked mulligan stew, turnips, carrots, cabbage, potatoes, beans, cornmeal, and a chunk of beef, everything boiled together in one pot. The leftovers fed them for 2 or 3 days. Monday, Ella washed clothes outside the cabin in a big iron kettle heated over an open fire. Billy, being the eldest, had to cut locust limbs for the fire. He was also expected to fill the kettle with water, a difficult chore for a boy his age and size. "William," she called. "Yes, ma'am." "Go to the spring and get a bucket of water." Billy thought of how that heavy cedar bucket strained his shoulder, even when it was only half full. He felt in his pocket for that piece of peppermint candy wrapped in paper. Then he found his brother Edward and said, "Humpy?" Billy often called his brother Humpy. "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll let you lick on this candy until I count 10 if you'll go and get that bucket of water for me." Edward gladly fetched the water, and Billy rewarded him by holding out the peppermint stick. Billy started counting. 1, 2, 3. Edward, licking as fast as he could go, complained, "Not so fast. You're counting too fast. Start over." Billy started over, and Edward got a few extra licks. Then Billy wrapped up the peppermint stick and put it back in his pocket. There were other chores to do on Monday, but as long as his candy held out, Billy was a young man of leisure. On wash day, Ella used a long, flat hickory stick to stir clothes in the boiling kettle, fishing them out when they were ready. She kept the stick hanging on a nail just inside the cabin door. That hickory paddle served many functions. Ella mashed lumps out of the straw-tick mattresses with it, then smoothed out the bedding quilts. Charles also used it as a rod of correction. Sometimes, if one of the boys had been bad and was expecting a spanking, the hickory stick would mysteriously disappear. Charles always managed to get by without it, using instead his razor strap made out of an old belt, or else the ramrod from his rifle. All the little Branhams got an education out in the woodshed, running around their father as hard as they could go while he whipped their bottoms red. Charles called this beating the devil out of them. On one occasion, Edward hatched a mischievous plan. "Billy," he said, "Mama and Papa are hoeing in the garden. If you go in and get some sugar, I'll get the crackers, and I'll meet you in the barn." It sounded fair enough to Billy. Ella kept the brown sugar in a box in the cabin. She often mixed it with water to make molasses for their breakfast pancakes. Billy slipped into the cabin, dug out a big handful of sugar, and started for the barn. The garden was halfway down the hill between the house and the barn. Charles straightened up from his hoe, wiping his forehead with his red and white checkered handkerchief. He noticed his oldest son walking with his forearm as stiff as if he were hiding something. Charles said, "Where are you going, William?" "I'm going down to the barn." "What have you got in your hand?" Billy thought, uh-oh. He tried to be evasive. "Which hand?" Charles said, "Come here." Billy didn't want any more sugar for a long time after that. Late in August of 1916, after a steam-powered threshing machine had finished processing the grain crops, Ella stuffed new straw into all her tick mattresses. That night, shortly after the boys were sent to bed in the loft, Billy screamed as if a banshee had touched his cheek. Ella dashed to the ladder and called, "Billy, what on earth's wrong with you?" "Mama, there's something in bed with me." "It's just a grasshopper trapped in the new straw. Now settle down and go to sleep." "Mama, I can't go to sleep with that critter jumping around in there." Ella took the coal oil lamp in hand and climbed up to the loft so Billy could see to open the side of his tick, dig around in the fresh straw, and find the offending grasshopper. He let it go outside by pushing it through a crack where the roof did not butt evenly with the wall. Later Ella chuckled about the incident when she told it to Charles, but she could not tell her husband about her deep concern for Billy. The boy had been edgy lately, and his food wasn't setting right. More than once in the past month he had complained of an upset stomach after supper and of burping up stomach acid. Was he nervous because he would soon start school? Or was something else bothering him? Could it be connected with his father's drinking? In September, Billy and Edward started school together. Billy was 7.5 years old. Although he was 11 months older than his brother Edward, in size they could have passed for twins. Edward was just a smidgen shorter. Billy had no clothes for school. Through the summer he had gone barefoot and without a shirt, wearing a pair of patched and tattered bib overalls. The family could not afford new clothes, so Ella improvised. She took the coat Charles had worn on their wedding day, cut it up, and sewed together a pair of pants. Charles came home with white socks and a used pair of tennis shoes that barely fit, and that completed Billy's wardrobe. When Ella finished dressing him for his newest adventure, she said, "There, now let's have a look at you." She stood back for perspective. His bare ribs made him look so small and skinny. He looked so backward with his shaggy hair hanging down his neck, his homemade trousers, and his second-hand tennis shoes. Ella smiled and said, "If you don't look like a windy Kentuckian." She had done the best she could with what she had. Unfortunately, her oldest son would have to go to school without a shirt. So on a chilly morning in September of 1916, Billy and Edward trudged down the river road to Utica Pike's school. which was a typical rural one-room schoolhouse set among the hills in view of the Ohio River. Mrs. Temple would be his teacher for many years. She taught all 8 grades, with students ranging in age from 6 to 15. In school, Billy learned more than the 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Suddenly his view of the world expanded. As he sat in class, he had time to compare himself with the other children. The differences shouted at him. These were country boys and girls like himself, but most of them wore nice clothes and shoes that fit, and they all wore shirts. For lunch, the other children ate sandwiches and had cookies or cake for dessert. Billy ate beans, and some days he had no lunch at all. He began to realize his family was poor. From the first, Billy was branded as an outsider by the older boys. They called him a corn cracker and teased him because he talked funny, with a hillbilly accent typical of the Kentucky mountain folks, and they laughed at him for looking so ragged. A few weeks after school started, Billy and some other boys his own age decided to spend an afternoon fishing at the ice pond behind the Branham's cabin. They called it the ice pond because Mr. Wathan cut blocks of ice from it every winter, stored the blocks in sawdust, then used them during the summer to keep ice boxes cold in his dairy. Billy was thrilled that these boys included him in their plans. Not only did he love to fish, but he longed to be part of the gang. After school, Billy ran home, eager to get his homemade fishing pole down from the loft. His tennis shoes did not fit well and had caused a painful corn to form on his big toe. That day in school, he had been preoccupied with the corn. Each time he moved his foot, the corn tortured him so much he could not keep his mind on his schoolwork. Now, in his excitement and haste, he easily ignored the pain. He dashed into the cabin and had just placed a foot on the sapling ladder when a powerful hand gripped his shoulder. His father turned him around. "Billy, I've got an important job for you to do this afternoon. I want you to pack water up to the stills for me." Billy's heart and limbs petrified. "But, Papa, I was going to go fishing with my buddies this afternoon." "You can go fishing tomorrow. I'm fixin' to run off a batch of corn whiskey tonight, and I'm behind. I've got to have enough water in the shed to keep those coils cool. You're old enough to work, and I've got to have your help. The buckets are down by the barn, sitting next to the pump. Now get on up and change your clothes. I'll be out back in the shed getting the stills ready." Slowly Billy started up the ladder, turning his head so his father would not see his tears. "And remember," Charles added, "keep mum. Not a word about this to anyone." "Yes, Papa." Although national prohibition would not be voted in until 1919, certain states had anti-liquor laws in place as early as 1906. In 1916, Indiana was already a dry state. Charles could not do without his whiskey. Since he did not have enough money to buy it on the black market, he and a neighbor, Mr. Dornbush, fabricated a moonshine still in the shed behind the house to cook up their own homemade brew. After selling their leftovers to thirsty neighbors and pocketing a little extra money, they had decided to build a second still. Tonight they were going to fire up both stills, and everything had to be ready. Billy sat in his straw-tick mattress for a long time, feeling the corn on his foot throb with each beat of his heart. Eventually he roused the strength to change. With great relief he yanked off his shoes. Slipping out of his school pants, he wiggled into his old bib overalls. The cloth shoulder straps were missing, and now the overalls were held up by twine with nails for buttons. The nails slipped easily through the buttonholes in the bib, and when turned sideways did not come out. Next he stumped his toe, which meant he took a corn cob and tied it under his painful toe to keep it out of the dirt. Slowly he climbed down the ladder and plodded down the hill to the well by the barn. 2 molasses buckets were sitting next to the pump shaft. Billy pumped them full. Each bucket held half a gallon of water, and it was all his 7-year-old muscles could do to lift them by their makeshift twine handles. That afternoon was warm and perfectly calm. Not a breath of air stirred the dry yellow grass. As Billy started up the path, he heard laughter coming from the ice pond not far away. His buddies were already there, fishing, joking, having a good time. Billy's disappointment broke loose in a flood of tears. Halfway up the hill next to the garden, Billy sat down to rest under the shade of a large silver poplar tree. Muddy streaks marked his cheeks where the tears had dribbled. He moaned, "Isn't it horrible? All those boys out there fishing, and I have to stay home and pack water." He heard a sound like leaves rustling in the wind. Whoosh! But Billy couldn't feel a breeze. He thought, "What's that?" And he looked around. The leaves, which had just started to turn brown, stood perfectly still. Nowhere could he see even a hint of wind. He continued his sulking. "Their papas don't do this. Why should I have to pack water to these moonshine stills?" He could hear the leaves blowing again. Standing up, he looked up into the branches above him, but he couldn't see anything moving. He squalled out a few more complaints, then picked up his buckets and started up the lane, his stumped toe leaving a peculiar track behind him on the dirt path. He had walked only a short way when he heard that noise again. Whoosh! Louder than before. Billy turned, and this time he saw it. A whirlwind stirred in the branches halfway up the tree. That in itself was not peculiar. Whirlwinds were common in the fall. He had often seen them spinning through fields, picking up dried leaves and carrying them along. But those whirlwinds were always traveling somewhere, always moving across the ground. This whirlwind seemed to be caught in one place. Fascinated, Billy watched the green, brown, and yellow leaves rustle and swirl. Suddenly a voice boomed from the tree, a deep, resonant voice saying, "Don't ever drink or smoke or defile your body in any way. There will be a work for you to do when you get older." Billy heard the words as clearly as if his father was talking, but it was not his father's voice. He had never heard such an awesome voice before. Dropping his buckets, he took off running for the cabin, screaming with all his lungs. Ella scooped him up in her arms. "Billy, what is it? Did you get snake bit?" She thought that perhaps walking past the garden her son had stepped on a copperhead, a poisonous snake common in that country. "No, ma'am," he babbled, pointing down the hill towards the garden. "There's a man in that tree down there." "Oh, Billy, Billy, come on. Did you stop and go to sleep?" "No, ma'am, there's a man in that tree, and he told me not to drink or smoke." Ella laughed at this. She hugged her son and kissed his forehead, trying to soothe his nerves, but Billy stayed hysterical and would not calm down. She put him to bed, then hurried to the nearest neighbor who had a telephone and called a doctor. After hearing the story, this doctor said, "The boy's just nervous. He'll get over it." That night, Billy repeated his story at supper. "There's a man in that tree, and I heard what he told me. I ain't never going by there again." And he never did. From that day on, whenever he went to the barn, he would bypass the poplar tree, circling round the far side of the garden. 2 weeks later, Billy and Edward were up in front of the cabin playing marbles under the apple tree when suddenly Billy felt something peculiar come over him, a pressure that set his skin tingling as though some type of unseen energy had surrounded him. He looked up. Somehow the Ohio River seemed closer than it had before. As Billy gazed down the river towards Jeffersonville, the wilderness changed in front of his eyes. A bridge formed up off the banks, spanning the river, piece by piece, being built in fast motion. It was not like the low, flat bridges he had crossed when he had moved to Indiana. This bridge looked huge, with a vast iron trussed arch overhead. Billy had never seen anything like it before. Looking closer, he noticed men working high up on the superstructure. Then he saw a span break. Men tumbled off the beam in slow motion. Billy counted them as they fell. He watched 16 men disappear into the murky water below. Dropping his bag of marbles, Billy took off for the house, screaming uncontrollably. Ella did her best to calm him down. When he finally could tell his story, she said, "Billy, you just dreamed it." Billy insisted, "No, Mama, I got this funny feeling, and then I looked up at the river, and I looked right at it. I seen it. Oh, Mama, I'm scared." Charles gave his opinion. The boy's just nervous, like the doctor said. But Ella was not so sure. She remembered a day 4 years earlier when Billy had babbled something about a bird telling him they would live near New Albany. Oddly enough, that had come true. A bridge across the river? 16 men dying? What if someday it happened? Ella wrote the incident down, thinking, "We'll see."